It went live while I was taking a sip. Caught me off guard. Welcome to episode 44 of the Adam Makes Beer Industry Pro podcast. Today, I'm excited to be chatting with Alex Rhinehart of Southridge Brewing. Before we get rolling, let me give a shout out to our fantastic sponsors that make content like this possible. Starting a brewery is a big step. Blickman Engineering is here to help. Since 2006, they've equipped hundreds of nano breweries for success. Their new 3.5 barrel Pro Surface electric brewing system cuts maintenance and saves at least 30 minutes per brew day with powerful under kettle heating. From 1 to 15 barrel brew houses to keg washers and grain mills, Blickman has what you need. Ready to go pro? Contact Phil or Tom at ProSeries at blickmanengineering.com. Blickman Engineering is a proud sponsor of this channel and loves to help brewers at every stage of their journey. Tracking and managing the financial health of your brewery is a primary pillar of success. Check out my boy David Lentz at Brewed Fiscally. This man has the industry experience and skills you need so you can focus on growing your business. Bookkeeping, fractional CFO support, financial management system designs, business plan review, hit up your boy. Check him out at brewedfiscally.com or shoot him an email at david@brewedfiscally.com. He's good people. Alex, I wrote the copy for one of those and the other one I didn't. But before I go too far here, as I mentioned before, I'm excited to be talking with Alex Rhinehart, owner Brewmaster at Southridge Brewing in Wilmington, Ohio. Alex cut his teeth at Warped Wing Brewing and most recently as head brewer at Fibonacci Brewing Company in Cincinnati. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Excellent, man. Excellent. So we might have more to talk about than I even thought after our pre-interview chat. We usually jump in to the little online green room about 5 minutes early. And we have a little bit more in common. We'll see what we all end up getting to. But Alex has far more training and is definitely, I can just say right now, he would be more the expert in this area. But we have a shared background as stage performers. Him probably a bit more illustrious than mine. But listen, you never know where the conversation goes. But kind of spinning off of that, Alex, like many of us, your career did not start in beer. What did you do before getting into the brewing industry?
Yeah, like you said, a lot of us don't really start in beer. We start somewhere else and we find our way here. So my original background, my original career was actually in sports medicine. So my undergrad is in athletic training. I interned. I worked on the Bengals medical staff for a year. After undergrad, I went to grad school, and then basically I was a sports medicine professor for the better half of a decade. And then I kind of got to a point in my life where I was having some issues with just things I felt about higher ed and how I felt about the medical industry, and was kind of at a crossroads, and decided I needed to take some time off from that and decide what I wanted to do. So I left higher ed, and the town I was in had this really great craft beer pub. That was like, you know what, I'll just go work here for a couple weeks and see where things go. So when they hired me, I was like, yeah, I'll be around for a few weeks. 4 years or so later, after being the closing bartender and working like 40 hours a week there, I was still hanging out there. And it was a great job. One, I loved being in the community, being a part of the community, and loved being in the craft beer scene. And it was a good payday too. I actually took about a $20,000 raise from my professor salary.
Isn't that wild how that works sometimes?
I know, right? So yeah, I was working at this great place. And then COVID happened.
Mm.
The place was sold. There's some policy changes, and it just was no longer the right place for me. So lost that job there, and was kind of looking for things just to find work. And at the time, like Urban Artifact was hiring. Had a great interview with them. Like Warped Wing was hiring. So basically, just was like, I just need to find a job at this point. I love craft beer. The science of it, the art of it's so cool to me. Let's see what can happen. So I was applying to those places, and then went for an interview with Warped Wing. And when I showed up, their head brewer at the time, Fred Pallant, was like, I really just read your resume and wanted to talk to you. He's like, you don't make any sense for us, but I just want to talk to you.
Yeah.
So
well, you do have that interesting duality, right? Because you have this science background, and then from stuff that we're going to talk about coming up later, you also have what seems to be like a little bit more of like an artistic, at least having an artistic lens when it comes to recipe creation and flavor creation. And like we said before, like with some performance background at all, that's an interesting duality there.
Yeah. So like I said, they were just like, hey, you just seem like a really cool guy. We want to talk to you. And they ended up hiring an intern candidate. He's still there. His name's Chris Warman. And he's a great brewer. But they called me and like, hey, we're hiring Chris. We still think you're cool, but just we don't have the spot right now. I don't know, like 4 weeks later, they call me back and they're like, hey, so we have another position and we want you to come hang out with us. And I will say that the staff when I started there was a really interesting staff. So, John Haggerty, the brewmaster and owner there, his background is architecture. Their head brewer at the time, Fred Pallant, he was an engineer by training. I had sports medicine. Chris was a chef. We all had these really interesting backgrounds.
Sure.
That we all just really fit really well because we all had interesting takes on kind of the beer and the art, or the science and the art of beer.
Sure.
So then I came into Warped and started working in the cellar there, and we had some turnover pretty quickly. So within a couple of weeks, it was basically Chris and I running the whole beer making system. And it was great because it was a little bit of a trial by fire for Chris and I. But also at that point in time, John had been doing his thing kind of at the pilot system in Springboro, was much more high level. But he came back into kind of everyday operations in the Dayton Brewhouse. And I will tell people all the time that, apprenticing under John is an invaluable education. For those people that don't know Haggerty, he is a great brewer, great mentor. I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but that's kind of my intro into craft beer.
No, you're good. I just did some stuff with them back in December. I kind of did a brewery tour. The canning line they have there is pretty wild. I've not seen one of those warming tables before that they have, and you plug in the cans on the backside and everything comes rolling all the way back through. So I did kind of a deep dive on their canning line, and then did some stuff on the hot side with them too. And John's a smart guy. He's got a heck of a background. Definitely an interesting place to be able to start things off for you. Yeah. So that's how you kind of found your way into the professional brewing side of things. What do you think, kind of taking from your past career life, What do you think is like a skill set or talent that you have that's served you well on the beer side of things?
So, I mean, coming from kind of that higher ed and that research background, because I was publishing research when I was teaching, you have to be really good at integrating information. So finding information, understanding information, processing it, putting it to work. And I think that served me really well to be able to kind of take that just fire hose of information that was being given to me at Warped and processing it. And you know, in sports medicine and medicine in general, there's kind of this idea of evidence-based medicine, which is just really a fancy way of saying, you know, iterative processing, right?
Sure.
So you take information, you develop a plan, you implement the plan, you see how it worked out, you change the plan, you do it again. And, you know, that's recipe creation, that's process creation. That's, you know, so having a good understanding and being able to pick up information quickly and apply and change, I think was invaluable for me in terms of being able to kind of hit the ground running a little bit in the industry.
Sure. And it is such a funny thing that you mentioned before, where I don't think people understand sometimes how quickly promotion happens in the industry, right? You know, like I remember back in the day when I was like actively, you know, looking at pro brewer for different jobs or whatever. And this was probably still when we were more in like the boom portion of the most recent craft beer boom as far as brewery growth. You know, people would be saying, all right, you know, we have our $3 million raised, you know, and they want to hire a head brewer with 1 year experience. And, you know, the funny thing is, you know, I was one of those, I was even less than that. So like when I hired into a spot in 2011, 2012, I was leaving teaching for it. And it was, you know, I was brewing at home, you know, and I took it very, very seriously, you know, probably more seriously than, you know, a lot of people that make beer at home. But it was still a big growth curve. But, you know, you look at those ads and people were hiring people with very little experience. And that was to start a whole new, you know, to launch a whole new brand. I don't think people realize sometimes how quick that turnover happens, you know, because it does for one reason or another. So you can find yourself in those situations. So how long were you with Warped Wing?
About 2 years.
2 years.
So I was working with them. Things were going great. And then one day I was actually, so we were doing only a single brew that day. So Chris was up on the brew deck and I was actually running the centrifuge that day. And just kind of scrolling things and I see this posting and the job description is from Fibonacci. They're looking for a head brewer and they basically write this description. For anybody that doesn't know Fibonacci, it's a very small nano, very much a sustainable food movement focused brewery. So they wrote this posting for a head brewer that they were looking for someone with brewing experience, but also they were looking for basically someone with sustainable food background in the Cincinnati area. And you know, after I talked to them and everything, it comes to find out they were like, yeah, we didn't think this person existed when we wrote this posting, but this was what we wanted, so we were just going to put it out there. Yeah. So I saw the posting. I took it up to Chris and I showed it to him, and he goes, "Did you write this for yourself?" He's like, "I'm pretty sure they just described you." Because I do have a background in sustainable agriculture as well. You know, I run a small fruit and nut tree farm in addition to all the other crazy things I do. Sure. So, you know, it was this really weird fit for me. So I interviewed with them and kind of after they offered me the job, I went in and talked to Haggerty and it's just like, hey, you know, I still think there's some things for me to learn here, but I also think that this is the right time for me to move on to learn a completely different skill set, right? Warped Wing being a big production facility, we're doing 30 barrels at a time, 8,000 barrels a year, then going to this very small nano, probably, the smallest place in Cincinnati.
How big is the system there?
It's a 1 barrel.
Yeah, bro. So I did time on I did time on a 10-gallon. So I flipped it 3 times in a day to make a barrel. Yep. So yeah, so we both kind of worked in 1 barrel breweries. All right. Okay. So very small batches, small batches.
So, but it's kind of one of those things where it's like, I think there's a part of what I need to learn that I'm not going to learn here. So I need to go do that. And he was very supportive of that. And, it's kind of like, hey, yeah, go learn. I can't show you that side of this. So go do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exciting. And so it is such a unique thing to then be able to get in to a place like that. And I think one of the things that sometimes you can neglect to think of, sometimes people think, oh, well, like the bigger the system, the cooler it is, right? There's like something attached to that. But I worked at a place for maybe it was 2 years on that little 10-gallon flip it 3 time thing. There's something about repetition. There's something about, especially when you're like process minded and when you want to learn new things, and then you have this opportunity to start, really experimenting, being able to do, the same things over and over and tweak, you know what I mean? Make changes here or there. I think that's one of the beauties of that nano system. What was that experience like for you as a brewer? How did that positively impact your growth curve, do you feel?
I mean, it's very interesting. It's like you said, everyone that you talk to thinks this idea of like, oh, the big places are awesome, and you got all these toys, and yeah, all the toys are great, and you need to understand how to use those. And the thing that I will forever be indebted to John and Warped for is this idea of just process, right? John would always say, he had one of his favorite quotes coming from his architecture background is God is in the details. Yeah. So there's I think his Mies van der Rohe, I think, was the architect. He was a modernism architect, and he had created this idea of like making things simple. Bringing out the simple parts of the architecture, but if you do those little pieces correctly, it makes these spectacular designs. So John would always like harp on process, right? So if he would say, if I give you really bad ingredients, but your process is spot on, you're still going to make good beer. If I give you the best ingredients, but your process is awful, your beer is going to be awful, right? So there's this idea of repetition and making sure your process is right that I learned from Warped, and taking that and applying that to a much smaller scale, and then being able to play more with kind of that art side of things, where it's like, all right, if I make a huge mistake on a flavor combination or something like that at Warped, that's a lot of money that is at risk. I make a mistake on 1 barrel. Okay, it's big money for us, but it's really not that much, right? So how do you take your understanding of good process and then go into the art of creating some really cool stuff and combining those to make out really good products?
And I think the conversation around recipe formulation is a bit of an odd one. So I by guilt, I feel like I feel it's necessary that I say, I did just put up on Instagram today that I did just order a mic for the GoPro that I use for recording, because I've kind of started a recipe writing creation workshop on the YouTube stuff, and so anyways, hopefully, I always feel guilty because that was like a couple months ago, but I hope to get that rolling again. but I think recipe creation and discussion around that can be a little bit weird. I don't think it matters whether you're talking about somebody that's brewing on the home side or on the pro side. I feel like sometimes maybe the secrecy increases as you go to the pro side. And I do understand, like, I do understand when people have like, sometimes I poke fun at it, like the proprietary notion of certain things, because I feel like, so much has been given, but from others to us. But so that recipe creation facet is really interesting. So can you speak to like how you went through that process? Because I'm assuming like you learned maybe some nuts and bolts working at a larger production house, but then going into a situation where you're doing full recipe writing, that's a whole different thing. Was there any resources you leaned on? What did that process look like for you?
So while we were at Warped, John, I think, recognized that Chris and I both had some talent for what we were doing, and basically turned the pilot system over to the two of us. And he acted kind of in a mentor role to help guide us. He basically was like, I want you to write some recipes. I want to look at them, and I'm going to help you walk through them. So there's a lot of like, calculations and nuts and bolts things he helped us with to do that, to the point where he finally got to, he'd just say, hey, we've got a spot in the pilot system. Who has a recipe they want to do? And, Chris and I would pitch it, and he'd be like, all right, we're doing yours. Let's go. But yeah, so, I think having Chris and I too at Warped was fun, because we came to beer from different places. I came from the science background. He had run kitchens for years. He came from the food side. So when we looked at recipe development, he very much was flavor centric, right? How he looked at it more like making a soup, where, I looked at it more like writing a research paper. Right? I needed to do my research paper, where I needed to find out everyone else that's talking about this style or what they're doing with this style. And I need to gather all this information and kind of funnel it down to what's best practice. And then that kind of sets my outline for where I'm going to start to play with things. So then I would write what I want to do, and then go back and look at, okay, considering what I want to do, how does that play with what everybody else is doing? And make some critiques. And then I would use, when I was at Warped, I'd usually kind of bounce it off Chris as well to get his, different input from it. So it was a lot of like just looking at, okay, what is this brewer doing, or what is, this style? What aren't people doing with this style? And creating kind of my first test. So which I think now when I explain recipe development to people, I typically kind of talk about this idea of there being a gradient, right? And that the idea is that we want to kind of meet balance. Because I think one of the things we get lost in a lot is not balancing beer. John used to joke all the time that, American beer was hoppy, overly hoppy, right? It was just like, oh, we've got this really hoppy
that's
beer.
That German training talking right there. I'm not saying it's wrong, but go ahead.
So it's like, American beer is really hoppy. What would make it better? More hops, right? So it's like, there's a place for that, but we do sometimes kind of get lost in just hitting people over the head with flavor profiles that are kind of one note sometimes. So I talk about this idea of creating balance. And what I do is I can start at either end. So I can either start with like a flavor profile, or I can start with a style of beer. And, obviously cut my teeth under John. And like you mentioned, he went to the VLB and has this big European beer background. I'm very Eurocentric in terms of what I like to brew. But I think those very traditional styles, whether they be Euro traditional or American traditional, are one, great beers on their own, but two, are great mediums for flavor profiles. So we can start at either spot. We start with the flavor and we try to find a medium that conveys that flavor well, or we start with a medium and we find a flavor that complements that medium. So for example, I do this chestnut beer. I do a couple chestnut beers, but this golden chestnut beer that I'm going to talk about, it started with a flavor. So I work with Route 9 Cooperative. They're a chestnut growing cooperative in Ohio, and Amy Miller runs that. And I've done some work with her for years. And one day she texted me and she said, "Hey, I was roasting these chestnuts for a baker and I forgot about them in the roaster. Over roasted them, not correct for what the baker wants, but the chestnuts taste like salted caramel. Yeah. Do you want them?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely, I want them." So I had this salted caramel flavor. So I start talking, okay, what do I do to balance that salted caramel flavor? So it's like, okay, to me, I'm talking like, those like Scotchy blonde bars, like those cookies, like something along those lines. Okay, so I'm talking sweet and light and maybe like a little bready, but not like roasty. Okay, so what does that speak to me as? Okay, that's a golden ale, right? But I don't want kind of that harsh, clean side of it. I want that like cookie side of it, right? So like, okay, I'm starting to think maybe we're looking at like English golden ale. So if I take flavor and that style, like that, those things combined get me kind of this really good balance area. So, that's how I think about a lot of my recipe development now is find the flavor, find the medium, and the idea is to get to here.
Sure.
And now I'm not saying you can't be over here, right? Or you can't be over here. But I feel too often, especially when we start getting with really complex flavor development, we lose balance a lot of times. And I think a good example of this, I was actually drinking a beer the other day. What was it? It had agave, grapefruit, coriander, and sea salt in it. And it was a good beer. But what I felt like happened to the beer is they kept adding more, right? So they probably started with that grapefruit and coriander sea salt flavor. They added the agave, and I probably got a little muddled. So they said, okay, let's add more of the sea salt and the coriander and the grapefruit. And they're like, oh, well, now it's too far this way. Okay, so let's add more. It felt like it just got lost at some point.
Sure.
Where if they would have taken the idea of balancing that a little bit more and putting less agave in to start, it probably would have been a cleaner, fresher, better tasting beer.
Sure.
But they just got so lost in the adding flavor when sometimes just less is more.
Sure. So, you mentioned balance and these, these traditional European styles that so often do that so well. I'd be interested in getting your opinion on something that I've found over the years. I think that a very large piece of when beers become unbalanced for me typically comes down to and not that it's the only factor, but for some reason in my mind the balance of a beer so often is affected by residual sweetness, right? So there's time when you want more residual sweetness, you want sometimes the body that can go along with that, you want to leverage that sweetness to magnify X, Y, or Z character of the beer. But there's also a breaking point on that too, where when you make it too sweet, you end up getting to the point where you're looking at, a pint that's half full, and you're thinking about the beer you wish you were drinking next, right? But you still have half this pint left. Has that been your experience with sweetness and things like that, especially when you use some non-traditional adjuncts like you have experience with?
Yeah, I think that residual sweetness is a hard thing to balance. And I agree with you that I think a lot of times it can be tricky in beers. When I was really early cutting my teeth in the craft beer world, I was like a barrel-aged stout guy through and through,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like I, just like a lot of the market, I was chasing sugar, right? And that's what was good to me. And there's still barrel-aged beers, when done well, are still amazing. But I think there was kind of a point where I was like, I started to get into these cleaner, low residual lagers, like Euro lagers. That's like, there's so much complexity here, even though like there's not that much going on. That I really started to be like, what are we doing here? So there are definitely times, especially like working with like the chestnuts, there can be some issues kind of balancing that sugar that's there. And one of the challenges of working on a very small system, right, is that sometimes control can be a little wonky.
Sure. Yeah.
So you have this idea of what the beer is going to be, and it comes out sweeter than what you want it to be. It's, to me, right, I just look at that as, okay, well, that's either a point for me to clean up process, or that's an understanding of, okay, when using this type of ingredient, I understand that I need to move my target one way or the other in terms of sweetness, or how do I need to balance that with a different flavor? Maybe it's bringing in like a spice, or a more earthy type flavor, right? So there's lots going on there, and I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, definitely, you're good. You're good, and it leads me into some of these other things that we had discussed before. You had said that you had worked with like roasted dandelion root. Can you talk to me about that? What that contributes in a beer? Because that's probably one of the first times that I've heard using something like that. And it's cool because it has this, I mean, I don't know about your yard or whatever, but that's one of those things that's pretty pervasive. So yeah, if you can dip into that concept for me a little bit.
Yeah, so I have this weird affinity for kind of this like Euro farmhouse centric beer development. Right. So when we look at beer over the centuries, it's an agricultural product. It's a farm product for workers in a lot of cases. Right. And a lot of these recipes were just developed by what was around. Right. So I really like this idea of using agricultural products that are very centric to your location. And like you said, dandelions are everywhere. Right. And when you start looking at foraging and sustainable agricultural, there is a ton of really cool things we can do with plants that we see every day, right? So there's this forager that her name's Marie Valjean. She lives in Brooklyn, and she wrote this great book called Forage, Harvest, Feast, I think is the name of it. And she talks about how she can walk through Brooklyn and create these great meals by just understanding the plants that are around her.
That's crazy, because when you said Brooklyn, you had me thinking for a second. So yeah, that's pretty wild. I'm sorry, continue.
So there's this idea of like, the more we understand the plants and the agriculture around us, there's some more cool things we can do, right? So that dandelion root beer kind of came out of this idea of what can I walk out my door and find to make a cool beer? And dandelion root, roasted dandelion root, is a pretty common substitute for coffee. So it's like, okay, so there's dandelions, I can get some dandelion root, I can roast it, I can basically make a coffee. Okay, so I got my flavor. What's my medium, right? So for me, one of my early loves, so I lived out in Hawaii for a while. One of my early loves was pipeline porter, right? This great coffee porter.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, we're going to make a traditional American porter, put some coffee into it. So we put these roasted dandelion roots into it to create a coffee porter. So I think a lot of those recipe developments just come out of my love and appreciation for like close agricultural products, right? What can I walk out my door? What can I go down the street and get?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So that's interesting to me. So did you, so we're talking like on a 1 barrel scale. Talk to me about what this process looks like, because first of all, you need to acquire said dandelion root. So how much did you harvest? How long did it take? How did you handle it? All that stuff.
So, like I said, I run a perennial agricultural farm as well. So I harvested, I would say 95% of the dandelions just from out in my orchard.
Sure.
And then obviously cleaning process, get a commercial roaster to kind of roast. All you're doing is basically throwing them into an oven at like 350, 375 for half hour, 45 minutes, depending on how long it takes.
Sure.
And then grind it up. And basically at that point, you just treat it like you would do dosing coffee. So
okay, so is it getting to the point to where it's like all the way dried then? If you're actually grinding it, so you're almost looking at like a coarse. I hesitate to say powder, but you're looking at something dry and coarse at that point, actually.
Yeah. And so with the dandelion root, like, so when I use agricultural products, they might find their way into the process at lots of different points. The roasted dandelion root I was kind of doing at the end of primary, letting it sit for a few days, kind of just treating it like a dry hop, and just tasting it every day or two and seeing kind of, okay, does it have the flavor I want yet before I either drop it out or transfer the beer off of it. So
yeah, that's interesting. So did you do so for a 1 barrel batch, and maybe you said it and I missed it, but I mean, how much weight wise or any other measurement wise did you actually have to harvest of the dandelion root?
So after roasting everything, I think it ended up being about half a pound or just a little over half a pound per barrel. Which I don't know what the actual starting poundage was, but obviously much more, seeing that you're taking the moisture content out of it.
Yeah, 100%. That makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting, man. So have you just done, like, in my head, one of the first things that I would have done is, had you made coffee with it before, or like whatever the coffee like drink is?
So I had made coffee with dandelion root before, but in general terms, when I talk about using a lot of agricultural ingredients, it really is just starting with making tea and trying to gauge what I think the sweetness would be for kind of my base style, and then making a tea that's kind of along that route and dosing and figuring out how much needs to go into that. So like, I think another example kind of along those lines is I did this beer that was a It's a Belgian golden beer, but it's the anniversary beer for Fibonacci. One of the owners really loves this local winery and loves this Purple Trillium red wine blend series. And she's like, I would love to do an anniversary beer where we age it in these wine barrels. So she gave me a bottle of that beer, and so I drank a glass of that wine. Or sorry, she gave me a bottle of the wine, so I could drink a glass of the wine, and just kind of like highlighted some of the flavors I was pulling out of it, kind of some of this dark pepper and these olive type flavors. So it's like, okay, what balances that? And my first initial thought was, a Belgian golden, and specifically the beer that came to mind was Le Chauffe. So it's like, okay, I think those balance well, but there's something else that needs to be in there, right? I've got a little bit of these spicy, a little bit of these savory flavors. I need to brighten those flavors up a little bit. So, at the farm, because I manage a little bit of a farm at Fibonacci as well, we're growing this bronze fennel that is this great, like bright licorice flavor. And I was like, I added coriander and some white pepper to give it kind of these brighter flavors into the beer. And then so I started a little bit of like a Solera project with those, using a couple of the wine barrels, so that each of the barrels kind of gets blended through the process. And then the last barrel that they go into actually is inoculated with some Brettanomyces.
There you go.
To give it kind of this farmhouse, because I mean that's what that beer is. It's a farmhouse beer through and through, to give it this really like great farmhouse bite to it, and give it this little funk. And it's one of those beers that, like I said, it's kind of the Solera type project, and it's their anniversary beer every year. So like every year there should be a new iteration of what's coming to the consumer, and it should show a maturation in that beer. And inoculating that barrel with that Brettanomyces is going to, every year you're going to get a little funkier, a little different type flavor out of it. And each new barrel I make of it, I might be like, oh, I feel like next year's beer needs a little bit more bronze fennel, so that batch gets more bronze fennel, so that I can play with blending a little bit more, to get some cool flavors. So yeah, you kind of, I literally was just taking that bottle of wine, that glass I had, and I was going through my spice cabinet at home and being like, oh, I think it needs coriander. And I'd put some coriander in a glass and be like, okay, that's great. And then I'd be like, oh, maybe it's this. And I'd add something else in. I'm like, nope, that's not it. Right. So there's a lot of play that happens.
Well, and you do something that I think is really important. I remember when I was first getting into the homebrewing side of things, and I got really involved in like judging and whatnot, and I went all like over the edge with the whole thing, like I typically do. And I was getting really frustrated with the I'll say the word quality, even though it's not the right word, and we'll come back to it, but with the quality of my palate. And I came to learn that, the advice that I got, not directly, but on a podcast from Jamil Zainasheff when he was doing stuff with the Brewing Network, he's like, you basically just need to taste and smell all the time. He said, if I ask you what concrete smells like on a hot day when it starts raining, you know what that smell is, right? And so like I just started trying to become like aware of things. I found out that now I smell everything I eat and drink, you know what I mean? And to some people it's weird, you know what I mean? But mostly I'm just with my family, or, like when I was at the brewery, people I work with, and they just know you're already a weirdo. But it's one of those things I don't think people understand so much. Like I used to think, oh, well, I have this bad palate, and really it's an uninformed palate, right? More than anything else, because I feel like once you learn those flavors and aromas, whether you're talking about like technical beer evaluation or not, people have different sensitivity levels, but still you can you can educate your palate so much more. And to hear you talk about just that process of actually not just, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to smell and taste this beverage, but also going to, the spice rack and pulling those things out and getting an idea of those things. And the list of what you can do that stuff with is almost endless. One of my favorite things that I did when I was, I don't remember if I was on the pro side or home side at the time, but I listened to this killer interview with a killer podcast with, it was a wine guy who also had his foot in the beer side of things. And this was kind of before a lot of Americans were doing the beer wine barrel type thing. And he was talking about, the different characters of the different oaks. And so one of the coolest sensory things I've ever done was just taking some different types of oak cubes, American oak heavy, American toast medium. At the time it was Hungarian oak, French oak, different toasts. And I made a tea with those, each individual one, and just even smelling that and sipping on that. It's so fascinating. So I think I love that you mentioned that, you're going to the spice cabinet, you're doing this, you're doing that, because there's so much opportunity to understand that. If you're ever working in a place that's attached to a kitchen, or you go into a restaurant, I love trying to think about, all right, what do I smell right now? When I was at Cartridge, when we first opened, they were doing a lot of things from scratch. So there was a lot of prep work going on in the morning, and I would walk in and I would be like, all right, what just hit the flat top? I can smell something right now. And then just being able to pop your head and go, hey, what is that? I don't know. I think it's a really powerful thing to do for translating that ability to getting flavor and aroma into beer. So I'm really excited that you mentioned that.
It's like I tell our bartenders all the time that, it's not, because they'll be like, oh, you have this great palate. I'm like, no, it's just I've created a Rolodex in my mind. Sure. Of aromas and flavors, because I'm cognizant of the fact that I need to be doing that. So it's like when a customer asks you, okay, what does this IPA taste like? And your response is, it's bitter. Mm-hmm. Like, no, you've completely missed the whole point. Yeah. I was like, are we? First of all, it's probably not even really bitter. I think a lot of Americans, bitter and astringent, they don't understand the difference between those two. Mm-hmm. I was like, so, let's take those words out to start, and let's talk about, is this thing floral? Is this thing woody? Is it wet woody? Right? Mm-hmm. And these little differences in those flavor profiles. And like you said, at Fib, a lot of the bartenders will make fun of me, and my wife makes fun of me all the time, because I will lick just about anything to see what it tastes like. So like two great examples, like I had a book one day, and I was smelling the book, right? And this book had this great smell to it. And I licked it. My wife was like, what are you doing? I'm like, it's another entry into the Rolodex. I needed to figure out what this was. It's like,
that's dedication, brother.
Yeah.
That's dedication. Dedication to the craft. I like it.
I don't know what it's going to give me, but it's another entry there. And I think where that comes out is I made this variant of one of our golden ales that I put some mint into. And when I wrote the description for the beer, I was talking about the flavor being a mint candy, but I described it as being a stale mint from your grandma's purse. And when I made that description and our customers started drinking it, they were like, yes, that is 100% what it is. But if you had just said that this is, it's a mint candy, that's not it. Sure. It's a stale mint from your grandma's purse. So understanding kind of those nuances in things can be really helpful, because One of the other things I talk about with beer a lot is this idea. So my last name is Rhinehart. My ancestry is Swiss German. We were in Summerswald, Switzerland for hundreds of years, which is known for the Swiss rail clocks, right? So this idea, I say that there's this German-Swiss idea of complexity through simplicity. And I think when we look at beer is a great example of this, right? That we have, German beer is basically 4 ingredients, but we get these massive style differences. And I think German beer and Czech beer, kind of that region, became so good because they were forced to create great complexity through process with a very simple process. Right, so it's those little details, it's those little changes that make these incredibly complex beers. But at the end of the day, they're really simple, right? So
Sure.
a mint golden ale is very simple, but the difference between a fresh hard candy mint golden ale and a stale soft mint golden ale from your grandma's purse are very different.
Yeah.
Understanding that those from here to here, the things we did weren't that much different, but they made big differences.
Yeah. So, staying on this kind of this tip of, spice, herb, vegetables in beer, what have you. I know you have a little bit of background making gruit as well. Can you talk to us just a little bit about just kind of what gruit is, and then what your approach has been to making that in the past?
So the gruit comes again out of that kind of that farmhouse, making a malted beverage with what you have around. So before we really made the switch to using hops all the time, we used herbs as bittering agents and flavoring agents and preservation agents. So all gruit is basically using some form of plant material to substitute for hops. So I haven't made a whole lot of them, but I think one of my favorites did a gruit ale that was rosemary, sage, ginger, and spruce tips. So basically, you want to make sure that you're using some form of the rosemary as a preservation agent, and then the sage can act as a antimicrobial as well. And you want to make sure that you're balancing the preservation agents and flavor agents. But also, when we talk about traditional gruits, right, they were also made with some plant materials that were psychoactive that we don't necessarily want to be using in our gruits, and the TTB would not be very happy if we were using those in our beers. But I think there's still, even if you don't make a traditional gruit that is 100%, no hops, if you're still just using kind of a gruit style ale with hops, there's lots of flavor potential to be developed with some of those plant materials.
Sure. And one of the things that I like to think about is, I think part of one of the useful things about being knowledgeable about different styles of beer is, you can start to look at them in the way that you kind of understand what the individual parts are doing, right? And I think sometimes we can get very dialed into this notion of, okay, well, bitterness is what is going to be creating one of the primary things is going to be creating balance or a counterpoint to the residual sweetness that is in the beer. And I thought it was interesting when you were talking about that. And sometimes you have to bump into the culinary side of things. And just for the purpose of our conversation, we'll separate the idea of beer and culinary, even though you really wouldn't need to. But
Right.
like when it comes to cooking and whatnot, there's different ways to balance sweetness in food, and it's not with hops, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's different ways to do that. So I thought that was interesting with some of the things that you were talking about, including in some of the gruits that you've made, because obviously there are some of the things that, as you mentioned, have some antimicrobial factors to it as well. But when I thought about ginger in a beer, ginger can definitely be a counterpoint to sweetness. You know what I mean? So I think it's an interesting build, and I think that was a big shift for me when I started thinking about other things and what's creating balance in beer.
Yeah, so like I love using ginger as a counterpoint to sweetness in beer. So a great example, I did this dark saison last fall. So at Fibonacci, we did a party for each of our solstice and equinoxes, and I wanted to create a themed beer for each one. And this year, last year, I had a total overall theme for each one of them, that the beers were going to be kind of in this traditional Eurocentric style, whatever that meant, like farmhouse Eurocentric style. So I did a gruit style. I did a Lichtenheiner. I did a farmhouse saison, and then I was going to do a Sati, but so for anybody that doesn't know, Fibonacci got put up for sale, and so I didn't do that beer just because of lots of things. But but the farmhouse was for the fall, and I said, okay, to me, this season is all about harvest and preservation and getting ready for the winter that's to come. Like, to me, from a farm standpoint, what is fall? And I said, it's soup season. So, okay, what's this really cool agricultural product that we could do soup season wise? And it's like, okay, it's like, let's play with the idea of like carrots, doing like a carrot soup, right? This carrot soup is very like earthy and warm and inviting and getting you ready to kind of hunker down for the winter. It's like, okay, so what balances that? Because carrots are very sweet when you actually like look at sugar content. So it's like, what balances that? So let's balance it with one, the saison yeast, right? It's going to give you that little bit of bite. But two, let's put some ginger in there, kind of cut that sweetness a little bit. I was like, okay, I feel like they're balanced, but they're kind of still one note-ish.
Sure.
So I added spice bush, which I grow at the brewery.
What is that?
It's a local native bush that puts out a little berry, and it's kind of got like a hot cinnamon type flavor to it.
Okay.
So I was like, I feel like we're kind of one note-ish. The carrot and ginger are balanced, but I need just a little bit of oomph to it. So
sure.
I took this spice bush and added a little bit to it, just to kind of give it a little bit of complexity to it. So yeah, ginger as a counterpoint to sweetness is great, but it's also one of those flavors that is very easy and very quick to be something you can hit people over the head with.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
So, I think that was probably one of the beers recently that was the most nerve-wracking to make, because I knew that too much ginger was going to make the beer undrinkable, but not enough would have made the beer seem Amateurish might be the best term.
Yeah.
So it was like, you gotta hit this one right. And it was very well received. We sold it really well. And I loved it. Actually had my last crowler of it the other day that I had been saving.
Nice.
But it turned out well, but it was nerve-wracking to be like, knowing what I know about ginger and balancing these flavors, this is what I think it should be balance-wise, but I don't know. So
for sure. Well, speaking of nerve-wracking and going in a slightly different direction, I know there's a lot of people that follow the podcast that eventually want to have their own brewery, open their own brewery. So let's kind of talk about how the new brewery is going. And so can you tell us a little bit about Southridge?
Yeah. So I guess, let's see, good place to start, I guess. So we're opening Southridge Brewing in Wilmington, Ohio. It's actually in the building that Brewhouse Brewery used to be in. I will say that I never really set out to open my own place. That wasn't the goal. Like I was always kind of preparing myself in case the opportunity presented itself, but it wasn't kind of the goal. I was doing great things at Fibonacci, love working there. But I said early on that I had worked at this great craft beer pub, and we had this amazing chef, Jen Perky, that was there. And when I was there, that pub was the kind of community heart. That was the place where, if you walked in on a Wednesday night, Friday night, whatever it was, that was where the movers and shakers were. That's where your friends were. You were going to, no matter when you walked in, there was going to be somebody there that you wanted to talk to. And since we've all left there, like I left there, Jen left there, the community's kind of been missing that, right? It was the craft beer hub, it was the food hub, it was the community hub. So the town that doesn't really exist right now for the town. So I've known my partners, Brad Hayes and Jen Perky, for years. And we've even been like in a beer share group for, 15 years together.
Nice.
And, we've always kind of talked over the years that, we should do something. Yeah. And about a year ago, maybe a little less, they came to me like, hey, we really kind of feel like we need to fill this niche. Would you be interested? And I was like, yeah, but it's got to be the right scenario.
Sure.
Like, I don't just want to go do it.
Yeah.
So we were talking, and kind of late December last year, we'd had a conversation. We're like, all right, we'll get together after the new year. We kind of have a general plan for where we want to go with this, but we'll come back to it. And that was like a Monday. Tuesday, Brad calls me and says, hey, I've got this great opportunity to buy this building, yada, yada, yada. But we got to do it now.
Yeah.
He was like, do you want to do it?
Yeah.
I was like, well, not quite the plan, but I think it makes sense. Let's do it.
Yeah.
So it's been a bit of a whirlwind. I will not lie. It is every day you wake up and you're like, okay, what's the list of things that has to happen today?
Sure.
And there are great days where you accomplish that whole list. And then there are days where you feel like you did nothing, even though you do accomplish something.
Yeah.
So it's been great, but it's also a huge undertaking. So I saw Haggerty for the first time at the Ohio Craft Brewers Conference a couple weeks ago, And so for the first time since we had announced that we were opening, and just kind of walked up to him and I was like, am I stupid? And I was like, or do you want to lecture me on my hubris for doing this? And he was basically like, no. He's like, I've seen what you're going to do. He's like, I think it's great. He's like, it's not easy, and it's not.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things, because I get asked, I've been asked a lot over the last couple of years about like, hey, we should open a brewery, right? Everyone thinks it's fun, but you got to do it for the right reasons. And my ownership group and what we're doing, we really do see it as a community-centric hub. And I am a firm believer that the future of the craft beer industry is in very, local breweries that are community integrated. And I like to, kind of playfully refer to it as the Euro pub model, right?
Sure.
They're, all throughout Europe, there are these local pubs on every corner that is serving a small amount of people. And, in the US, we had this massive craft beer boom, and we couldn't make enough beer to supply the demand. And we've met that, right? And, often you'll hear, is the craft beer industry dying? No, we only, several years ago, did we meet the number of craft breweries in the US as we had pre-prohibition.
Sure.
It was just the difference between, pre-prohibition and kind of coming back was logistics, right? We could make all the beer in the world in St. Louis and ship it all over the place. But I think there's a community support and a community integration model that can't be served by that we're starting to see more and more demand for, and people realizing that that's how you're going to really achieve, you as the consumer, what you want.
Sure.
I think there's still space for lots more places. People just have to understand that the idea of opening and being a Rheingeist is not realistic, right?
Yeah.
You have to open and understand that your goal is to serve that community. And if that isn't goal one, I don't think that you're necessarily going to be super successful.
It's gonna be uphill. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And we had talked, obviously a little bit about the nano type build that you're working with Fibonacci. On the brew house side, what are your plans for Southridge?
Yeah, so like I said, this place previously was a nano. There's some infrastructure issues in terms of growth for the building. There's obviously some equipment that's still here that I can utilize, but there's also this idea of making sure that we meet a minimum standard of what good quality product is.
Sure.
I'll be able to function a little bit off of what we have, but the plan is to build out a new building for production. So we're going to add a small addition onto the building, run a 5-barrel system. The focus will be kind of traditional beer, and that's what I tell people. And I was like, what that means to me, obviously I cut my teeth under a very Eurocentric brewer, with John having studied in Germany, and I have a very high appreciation for the quality of product that's made in Europe. But I also think there's some really good quality American-centric traditional styles. A couple of years ago, actually right when I released that Dandelion Porter for the first time, David Nielsen wrote an article basically saying no one's making good quality porters anymore. And I was like, hey, actually just released one today. It's a very traditional kind of American style porter. Yeah, it's got some dandelion root in it that's a little different, but it's still a very traditional style porter. So what kind of our goal for the beer wise is to use my concept of quality traditional styles, whether that be American or Euro, And that will be the base of what we do. But then there will be kind of some unique flares on some things, tapping into both my agricultural background and beer background, but also Clinton County is a very strong agricultural historically as a county.
Sure.
I actually did a collaboration with Sam Adams about a year ago, where we used some heritage red Fife wheat from a local farmer here in Clinton County to do some stuff. So there'll be some fun stuff like that, but
Sure.
Overall be kind of that traditional beer style off of a 5-barrel system, mostly selling in-house, growing to do a little bit of kind of local distribution, but not looking at a distribution model.
Sure. Well, that's very cool. I'm very close. I'm very close to there. And then it was funny. So when we ended up connecting at the OCBA conference, that was funny. I'm like, oh yeah, I drive past that place all the time. I think it's exciting because, first of all, when you're going around looking at places, the place has a big parking lot, which might not sound like the most exciting thing, but if you want to have a business, you need parking. So, it's got a good parking lot. It's got some space outside to be able to do some outdoor patio stuff. Very, very cool. And it's you get a lot of traffic through that area. There's a lot of traffic. So that's exciting. And I also know that the team that's been put together there is very hometown Wilmington, which I think is great. And I think it can help it can be one of the things that helps to make that connection with the community.
Yeah, like I said, it's an astounding team. I wouldn't leave to start a place without having a team. Like I wouldn't want to run the kitchen. I wouldn't want to run the front of house. Like that's not me. But I have a team to do that. Jen is a spectacular chef. When we announced that when we announced that we were going to be opening, we kind of announced the business, and then we announced the chef, and then we announced the restaurateur, then we announced the brewer. So like we did it in stages. And when we announced that Jen was on board, it was kind of just like, oh yeah, whatever else you guys do is cool. Like we're
awesome.
Jen, right? And then we announced Brad, and they're like, oh yeah, this is awesome. Brad's a very successful restaurateur in Wilmington. He runs a couple other places. Like, oh yeah, we'll be there for Brad. Then we announced me, and like, oh man, we were hoping it was Alex, that you guys had stolen from Cincinnati. Like,
sure.
And honestly, the brewery itself, Southridge, is about, I don't know, 6 blocks from the house I grew up in.
Yeah, man.
We didn't do that on purpose, but like, I'm born and raised in Wilmington. I left. I lived other places in the world, but came back. So it very much is, we didn't want to look at other places. Like it was only, we wanted to create a place in Wilmington for people.
Sure. So kind of and I know the stuff is flexible, but what are some rough timelines that people should be expecting to see things start? I'm not sure if I don't believe it's open yet, but
it is not.
And again, just believe me, we've both been around long enough, but people always want to know some sort of answer. So what's your answer for that stuff and some of the plan for rolling the business out?
So, to make a long story short, there are some economic conditions that make us want to open very quickly. So when we bought the building, the kitchen is pretty turnkey. So the idea is late spring, early summer to try to have the restaurant fully up and running and open. I can do some beer making here, but not quite up to the quality and quantity that I need. So I've been talking with Wolf Wing and some other people about doing some collaboration beers, doing some contract brewing with some people. to get things up and running while we do a build out for brewing operations here. So the idea will be restaurants up and running. We'll have some of our beer on tap, but it won't be a full tap list to start. We'll buy some beer from some other locals that I love,
Sure.
that have been helping us along the way. Been some of my mentors. So we'll have that tap list up and going until we can get our build out done and hopefully have me up and running fully sometime early next year. But
Beautiful.
Supplementing with what we can with our current setup until then.
For sure. Well, I love it, man. And there's a question that I always like to ask everybody. And if you could go back, and I have an age typed out here, but if you can go back and have a beer with 25-year-old Alex or 21-year-old Alex, and give that guy any career or life advice, what would you drop on him?
Well, I'd start with, I think 25-year-old Alex would be very shocked with current Alex. I was from a pretty young age, I kind of had this idea of what I wanted to do, and I was doing it, right? Yeah. I had hit the marks on the plan, and let's see, 25-year-old Alex was still, I don't know, half a decade away from blowing that plan up. So I think it'd be a little bit of a shock at what we're doing. But let's see, 25-year-old Alex, I'd probably be living in Canton still, working with the University of Mount Union. So there was actually this really great German brewery up there called German restaurant called the Gießenhaus. And their thing was they had this like around the world beer program. So they had beers from, very Eurocentric, but from all around the world. And if you drink, each time you drink, it was like 52 beers or something like that, you would get like a prize.
Sure.
And it was actually one of my really first, my first big introduction to beers from other places in the world was when I was living in Hawaii. I drank a lot of Asian beer. But the Gießenhaus was kind of really my first real in-depth dive to Eurocentric style beers. So I think I might tell 25-year-old me to drink more of them. Because they weren't hot then, right? It wasn't, everyone wasn't chasing Czech Pilsners yet.
Yeah.
But I had access to those early on. So I think beer advice would be drink more of them.
Yeah.
Life advice, I think, like I said, I think 25-year-old me would be a little shocked at where we end up. But I don't know, I think it would just be stay true to you, right? Because when I left my first career, that was a tough time, making the decision that basically everything I'd done in my life up to that point was to achieve what I had achieved, and to walk away from that was massily scary. So just to kind of give 25-year-old me a heads up and say, just stay true to yourself and bet on yourself, that you can do whatever you want to do with it.
Well, and there's also this attachment to being what we do for a living, right? You know what I mean? And so much of your identity and different things like that can surround that thing, right? You know what I mean? Yeah, for sure. I understand that.
And I tell people kind of along that concept. There's a singer-songwriter producer in kind of the Americana world named Joe Henry, and so we throw this festival out here in Martinsville every year called the Nowhere Else Festival, hosted by the band Over the Rhine. And they do these workshops in the morning. And one of the workshops one year was an interview with Joe Henry. And, I for years, I kind of struggled to put a concept to kind of my my life path and what I had done. And
Mhm.
because, I actually have this one friend that jokes that I have a 30-page resume because of all the stuff I've done, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So, I installed chestnut farms, and I
yeah,
run a perennial agricultural farm, and I am a brewer, and I used to work for the Cincinnati Bengals. And so I've done all these things.
yeah.
And, um, I was having a hard concept of like describing or justifying this varied path.
Sure.
And so during that interview, Joe Henry has asked a question, and his response was that more of us need to be unafraid to write a new narrative.
Mm,
And I was like, yeah, that's it, right?
yeah,
That, I think I've embraced the idea that writing new narratives, while hard and scary and intimidating, is what we all need to be able to do. And it doesn't mean we need to write completely new books, right? We just need to be able to be comfortable with adjusting that story of where we go. And I think when you get to that point, it becomes comforting a little bit,
sure.
because things then are just, challenges. They're not deaths of who you were. It's just, this is the next step.
Sure.
And I don't know that 25-year-old me was willing or able to accept that at that point. But
Sure.
that would be a good life lesson for 25-year-old me.
Nice. I appreciate you sharing that. Well, listen, Alex, we're going to wrap it up here. How can people stay in contact with what you have going on at Southridge Brewing?
Yeah, so you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram. We're just Southridge Brewing. Also, you can reach out to me, Alex at southridgebrewing.com. We're trying our best to make sure that we keep everybody updated in terms of what we're doing at the brewery and getting everything ready. We're fielding questions all the time about, when are you opening? Like, we can't wait. Da, da, da. I promise we're working hard to get things ready,
For
but
sure.
yeah, that's the best way to keep up with what we're doing. And if anybody has any questions or anything, I love to chat. I love talking beer. I love talking life philosophies. So
Awesome.
yeah,
Awesome. Well, Alex, again, thanks so much. And if you could just stick on the call just for a minute after we sign off here. And thanks again to my sponsors, Blickman Engineering and David Lentz from Brewed Fiscally. Go ahead and check them out for anything that you need on that front. I'm going to have I'm going to have another podcast coming up next week. We're going to be talking a little bit of sustainability with my friends at Dallam, and we're going to be talking about CO2 reclamation, if I'm saying all my words correctly. So keep an eye out for that. And as always, genuinely grateful that you're choosing to tune in, and I appreciate your support. I hope you have a great day and be good to those people around you. Alex, thanks again, man.
thank you.